What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the April 2018 format. Now, the reason I wanted to bring you guys this is that if you have a regional or maybe a YCS like YCS Memphis coming up towards the end of the month, I wanted to give you guys a good analysis of what the top decks are and why I feel that they deserve the status that they do on this list. This way you can best prepare for the event going into it, and you should know and have a pretty good idea of expecting what to beat. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons, as always. So big shout outs today to Connor, Jonathan, Jeremy, Casey, and Jeff. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 5, we have TRICKSTAR. Now, a lot of you guys are going to see this and wonder, Cimo, why do you have TRICKSTAR at the bottom of your list? Well, if you guys haven't been paying any attention to the YCSs since the February 2018 ban list, when the format was very embryonic, TRICKSTAR actually was taking a fair amount of the top slots. However, as the format has shifted and evolved, TRICKSTAR has been very much so in decline, and I expect this trend to continue. Now, the thing that you need to differentiate here is, although TRICKSTAR is the number 5 deck on this list, it's still going to have a rather high representation at any high-level event like a regional or YCS that you may attend. However, in terms of its success rate and how well the deck will perform, that's why it's on here as the number 5 deck. Because while the deck is rather consistent and has a lot of good things going for it, because of the fact that the deck doesn't necessarily have a solidified win condition, and because Draco's presence is now even more overwhelming than it has been in the past, I feel that because of this, Draco is just dominating, and that's basically forcing TRICKSTAR down into lower numbers, because that matchup is very difficult for TRICKSTAR to maneuver around. Not just because of Masterpiece, but also just because of all of the floodgatey or stun type cards that Draco has at its disposal. And so for those reasons, that's why I decided to put TRICKSTAR as the number 5 deck. The deck is still going to be very strong moving into this format. However, I still think that there are some better options that you can go about playing. Now this moves us on into number 4, and for number 4, we have Mech Knight Invoked. Now, Mech Knight Invoked, conversely compared to TRICKSTAR, has been on the uptick. Now, Mech Knight Invoked managed to garner 4 tops of the top 32 of YCS Salt Lake City, and this is really cool. Now, you can attribute this to several different reasons. I mean, this is a going second deck, and it's probably, since every other deck in the format wants to go first, you can blind second with this deck, and it's probably the best deck you can blind second with, and I think that is a very good benefit in a format where every other deck wants to play first. You also have the fact that the players that have been playing Mech Knight Invoked have been taking the time to master the deck and do a lot more well with it, in addition to teching out the deck for the meta since it has become more defined. You also can attribute to the fact that, you know, maybe more people are starting to pick up the deck because it is fairly simple in its playstyle, but it's also rather effective. I mean, you've got the Mech Knights to inflict massive damage to your opponent, you've got ALEISTER and just the whole invoked engine for consistency, and you're also able to pump out MECHABA, which is just a nice, good card to disrupt your opponent. It's obviously has its weaknesses in the fact that it's a very poor deck that goes first, but obviously, if you're able to steal a lot of those wins going second, then that's where the deck's strength lies. And I think that because the way the meta has been shifting and evolving, Mech Knight Invoked's been making its upswing and starting to see a lot more success than a lot of people might have given it credit for at the beginning of the format. So, or at least since Extreme Force's inception. So, I feel it's definitely deserving of that number 4 slot. Again, this is a deck that does have its weaknesses because going first, that deck really has no realistic play because, I mean, at best, it might be able to summon out, you know, a MECHABA, but realistically, that's not really too difficult to navigate around. But depending on how the deck is built and depending on who's piloting it, it can still be a very solid option moving into the April 2018 format. Now, this moves us on to number 3, and for number 3, we have 60 card variants. Now, if you guys remember back when I posted my first top 5 meta decks for the brand new format, once we had the February 2018 Forbidden and Limited list, I actually had 60 card decks in this same slot, and I actually decided to put 60 card decks back in this slot for a couple of different reasons. So, first off, a lot of you guys might argue that because TRICKSTAR is such a high representation in comparison, that might be more deserving of this number 3 slot. However, The reason I disagree with that is because I feel that even those 60 card decks, and I'm talking 60 card decks that include Lightsworn, zombies, and now dinosaurs, because that's becoming a much more staple feature of these 60 card decks, I feel that 60 card decks are a lot more explosive and a lot more dangerous in comparison to something like TRICKSTAR, even though its representation has been much smaller by comparison. These decks are incredibly potent when it comes to going first, when it comes to going second. The ceiling that these decks have in terms of the plays they're able to make and what they're able to do in a single turn is almost limitless depending on how good of a hand that you open, but you have to realize the kind of cards that these decks are playing. These decks are playing Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, which is one of the most insane boss monsters this game has ever seen. You've got stuff like Brilliant Fusion, which if that resolves, it's basically just game over. You've got Grass, which is just another big bomb of a card that, again, if that resolves, if your opponent doesn't have Ash, you're going to be in a very good position. And then you've got stuff like Fairy Tale Snow, which is one of the most incredible disruptors that this game still has, and it's still at 3 copies. So these 60 card decks are able to abuse that, and just because of the fact that this is a very strong deck going first and going second, and is able to be so explosive in the amount of plays and combo potential it's able to amass onto the board, that's why I feel this deck is very deserving of a number 3 position. At Salt Lake City, this deck got 3rd place as well as making top 32, and there were plenty of other 60 card variants that managed to make it into the higher rounds of the top tables, and I really think that, again, even though the representation on these decks may be lower by comparison to some of the other decks in the field, I think because they're much more explosive, if you go up against that matchup, it's going to be a much more difficult time than, say, in comparison to some of the other decks that you might face at those top tables. So definitely keep that in mind, that these 60 card decks are a threat to deal with, and you really do not want to undermine what these decks are entirely capable of. Now this moves us on to number 2, and this is a deck that I really wanted to put at number 1, but was just shy of making it. That deck is True Draco. If it wasn't for a couple of reasons we're going to discuss in the number 1 deck, honestly, True Draco is very close to making it to the number 1 slot on this list. However, the thing is, because of the other capabilities of the number 1 deck, and it can do things a little bit more unfairly, I had to put Draco at number 2. However, that doesn't mean Draco isn't an incredibly strong deck. I love seeing the fact that Draco was able to come in and really just be the anti-meta or the foil to the best deck of the format, being able to combat it in a myriad of different ways. I mean, you've got a Mono Iwado to basically shut down every play your opponent has, while you're able to resolve cards like Pot of Desires and Card of Demise without fear of hand traps. You've got an amazing boss monster in Masterpiece. You've got Dragonic Diagram, which is arguably one of the most powerful field spells in the game. You've got a ton of draw power at your disposal. You play a ton of stun cards, which is really difficult for a lot of decks to deal with. And I think what I like the most about Draco is the fact that not only is it good against the best deck of the format, but it also just kind of really just annihilates every other deck in the format, apart from maybe a few niche examples. But it's very difficult for a lot of these other decks that I've mentioned, not only on this list, but also have been making contention for slots on this list, for them to really play through Masterpiece, through the spells and traps that the True Draco player is capable of, Anti-Spell Fragrance, Skill Drain, the Monarch's Erupt, Rivalry of Warlords. All these incredibly powerful stun tools really make it so that it pushes all of the other rogue or maybe tier 1.5-ish decks down the ladder, and makes it so that True Draco is able to solidify itself in this number 2 position. I also like that, you know, it's a very linear deck to an extent. It isn't really too complicated, essentially establishing Masterpiece as your ultimate win condition, but you've also got the ability to break boards if you happen to go second, because you have the True Draco spell and traps, and not a lot of decks can really deal with that. Now, obviously you have to worry about stuff like Abyss Dweller, and that's something that 60 card decks are able to put up rather easily, as well as other decks as well, but it is still the second best deck of the format, so that's why I had to give it that number 2 slot. And finally, last but not least, this takes us to our number 1 deck of the April 2018 format, and that deck has to be Pendulum Magician. The reason I decided to give Pendulum Magician the #1 slot is basically for the fact that it has an FDK, it has the Zexal Lock, it has these things that are just so inherently unfair that if it goes first, if it wins the die roll, if it's able to establish the FDK, or if it's able to establish, you know, the Zexal Lock, your opponent really can't do anything about it, and you're just gonna win the game for absolutely free. Now, the thing is, because Draco is the second best deck of the format, Draco typically isn't playing any hand traps because it runs Card of Demise. So because of that, the fact that that's the second most represented deck, you're going to be playing against a deck that's not playing any hand traps, which means your FDK and your Zexal Lock are going to go through with a lot more consistency. And because we saw at YCS Salt Lake City, people were not respecting this deck as much as they should have been, FDK and Zexal Lock were able to pretty much just push through the initial 10 rounds of Swiss and make a majority into the top cut. Now, a lot of these Pendulum Magician decks did die off by the time we got to the top 8. However, that doesn't mean the deck is not nearly as good as Draco. It had higher representation than Draco in the top 32 cut, and really, it's been the most consistent contender across realistically every single event that we've had since we've gotten the February 2018 Forbidden and Limited list. The deck is extremely consistent and doesn't rely on draw power. It's able to establish multiple negations. You've got the fact that it can play very well going second. It's got an amazing extra deck, and thanks to Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite and the abuse of Astrograph Sorcerer, this deck can really take you anywhere and can do a lot of crazy and unfair things that some of the other decks on this list just can't keep up with. So guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your top 5 decks of the April 2018 format. If there's anything I forgot, be sure to let me know, or if there's anything you think might sneak up coming up in this following month, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.